Hi everyone, welcome to the Jobs Foundation's online briefing this afternoon. It's just gone 2 o'clock, so I'll just start the session and I'll let people roll in. We'll give people a few minutes just to get everything set up. We were just saying how it's nice that London is slightly cooler today, and it seems like we're not walking out into tropical heat, which is lovely, but can get quite tiring quite quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel bad complaining either way because it's so glorious when the heat comes,
I
um,
know.
and we're so quick to disparage it. But yeah, absolutely, it is nice to be able to like put on a jacket and not swelter.
There's been some vociferous debate about whether it's actually acceptable for British people to be complaining about how the heat in the UK is worse than the heat in other countries. I think it is because Britain is not built for heat. So 30 degrees here feels a lot
Mm.
hotter than 30 degrees if you're in Spain or France, where they've got aircon
Where
on.
they're equipped for it. That must be right. I heard an amazing thing on the weekend, which is that our grass seed is not is sort of substandard in the UK, which is why, it's mid-June and a lot of our grass is already scorched. Whereas in America, they have higher temperatures, but their seeds go down longer into the ground. So they can take up more water, which is why the Americans have green grass and up until August, it only scorches at the end of the summer.
I
So
think
you're right, we're not quite equipped.
I think we need to take our lead from the Americans and start importing some grass. But anyway,
Yeah.
I can see people have been rolling in, so I will kick off. Afternoon, everybody. Very warm welcome to this online briefing with the Jobs Foundation in collaboration with Workle. We're very thrilled to be joined by Kate Thompson, a renowned workplace wellbeing scientist, excellent entrepreneur, board advisor, and former C-suite leader for a conversation that feels very timely. Kate brings a combination of academic rigor and practical experience, which is very unique. And with a background in behavioral science and over 2 decades working in with leading businesses, she's helped organizations of all sizes transform how they approach well-being, leadership, and performance. As the founder of a successful people analytics firm and current advisor to both FTSE 100 companies and fast-growing startups, Kate has worked at the front line of what it takes to make ambitious change actually happen. She understands how to make workplace well-being not just an HR priority, but a strategic driver of growth, culture, and impact. This subject, the science and practice of creating happier, healthier work, is very important to us here at the Jobs Foundation. Obviously, our mission being to champion the role of business in creating opportunity, supporting people's progression, and contributing positively to society. It's a real core belief for us, I think, speaking for the whole Jobs Foundation team, that we really see businesses not just as engines of economic value, but also as engines of human potential. And I think that's an especially timely topic given the ongoing worklessness and mental health epidemic. That's really timely to be drilling into how businesses can best support people in the workplace. So in this session today, we'll be asking, why is workplace well-being such a hot topic? How should we define and measure concepts like happiness and mental health at work? And then really dive into what works and what doesn't work in terms of helping tackle that. And as I mentioned earlier, we're very delighted to be partnering with Workle for this session. Workle believes everyone deserves a happier working life, whether you're building your career or leading an organization. And we're really lucky to partner with them on a few events previously. So, founded by Lord Mark Price, the former managing director of Waitrose, Workle was created to improve the world of work through data, insight, and action. So, for individuals, they offer things like personalized tools and content to improve career satisfaction, and for businesses, they support them with data-driven solutions to boost engagement and retention. I can see some familiar faces in the audience and some new faces. So just in terms of formatting, we'll kick off with some discussion. We've got some questions here, but we also have an audience Q&A. So please do pop your questions in the chat box throughout. I'm very aware that I talked for way too long there. You're not here to listen to me. We're here to listen from Kate. So, Kate, there's lots being discussed at the moment about workplace happiness. It really does seem like one of those hot button issues that I read about in newspapers and I see on the TV. So, what's the context surrounding this at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I should say, Jamie, thank you so much for that warm introduction. And it's wonderful to be here. I know that sounds a bit sometimes trite to say on a webinar, but it really is. I have so much admiration for the important work you do at the Jobs Foundation. And as you say, mental health and well-being within work is such a core ingredient of that. And as you
I like
say,
that.
it is a hot topic. There's more fluency and focus on well-being in work than ever before. I think we're in quite a different place than even a few years ago. It's not just sort of a niche area anymore, but kind of part of mainstream business conversation. And there's a couple of ingredients that I think are worth noting in that. One is media momentum. You know, we've all seen it. There are headlines in Forbes and FT and HBR making the case that happiness and well-being aren't just nice to haves, but they're core to business success. And the idea is gaining traction there and sort of translating from editorial to executive thinking. But a second ingredient is that the data now backs up this narrative, so it's not anecdotal. And I think probably a great example of that is a recent survey by Harvard Business Review. They were analyzing 1,073 US executives and found that 87% believe that improving employee well-being gives them a competitive advantage. 87%. And that 8 out of 10 said that unhappiness actually actively harms productivity. I think another kind of ingredient in this growing attention is that employees are speaking up. So, you know, particularly since COVID, but I think we've been on a trend, employee expectations are high and rising. People are rethinking about sort of what matters in work and life. And look, I think that's especially true for younger generations who are looking for more, not just in terms of pay or perks, but around purpose and flexibility and, you know, emotional support. And then, of course, this whole topic is all set in the context of AI. So, you know, we'll no doubt get into this more today. I can't think of a conversation that doesn't touch on AI, but obviously it has the potential to reshape how work happens. And so, in a world where automation takes on more tasks, it's not just the quantity of work we need to think about, but also the quality of work, what it feels like, and how meaningful it is. So there's a lot of encouraging sort of signals and attention. But what I think is worth mentioning is that there's a bit of a catch. There's quite a frustrating gap, I think, between intent and action, and a sort of disconnect between what leaders say and what they're actually doing in this space. So it's brought to life really nicely in that Harvard study I mentioned, the one where, you know, 87% of leaders see the link between well-being of their workforce and competitive advantage, but only 30% then reported that well-being was a strategic priority, and then only 15% actually have a strategy in place for it. So it's that is quite startling, I think, that disconnect, and it's brought to life really nicely in a piece of analysis that was done last year, 2024, which was analysing the language used on company earnings calls by chief execs, which I find fascinating. And what they found was that executives talked about customers 8 times more than they talked about their employees, 8 times more. And when they did mention the workforce, it was often framed in terms of risk rather than opportunity or value. So there's a lot of evidence now, and a lot of attention that is sort of positive progress, but there's also a kind of a gap around action. And I'm sure we'll get onto it, but I think that's driven by a couple of things. I think it's driven by the fact that the data landscape is a bit of the Wild West in this space. You know, it's sort of, I think psychologists and social scientists are working very hard to clean up that mess, but it is still difficult to sort of sort the smoke from the fire. And also I mean, you mentioned this in, I think, one of the questions you've got for me, but there is a real confusion in what well-being really means and where it begins and ends. And until you can sort of wrap your hands around it, it's very hard for a business leader to make a move with confidence and, you know, and precision.
You alluded right at the end there to something that I wanted to ask you first, in that it is obviously such a big topic right now, but I think there's sometimes a general feeling that a lot of the time when businesses are talking about their workers and how they invest in them, and how they workplace happiness, it sometimes feels that this can be window dressing or whatnot. I don't think that, but what would you say the kind of reality on the ground is? Are firms feeling increasingly compelled to be talking about these things because they feel like it's a must-have if they want to attract good talent, or is it increasingly starting to define business decisions?
I think is it a must-have? I think as I just mentioned, it's sort of the intent I think is growing, and I think that intent is authentic, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think we've seen enough data, we've seen enough research, we've seen enough success stories. Business leaders do know this is important. We're heading into a future where a spotlight will be shone on the workforce. It's critical to business, it's critical to Great Britain and productivity, our ability to unlock our capacity. So I don't think it's lip service, that intent, but I think that we are still in the early days of understanding what action works and why it works and how to scale that action. So I think that at its worst, I can come onto this more a bit later if helpful, but I think at its worst, what we're finding is that the programs that are being receiving a lot of attention, or kind of that people start with, are what I would call kind of direct interventions, which are interventions that try and impact personal well-being separate from work itself, which is basically the wellness industry. Does that make sense? So it's things like kind of yoga classes and gym memberships, and I'm not sort of downplaying those. There's nothing wrong with those programs, and some are absolutely essential, like making sure that people have access to evidence-based mental health care through insurance and policies in particular. But overall, there is some skepticism, rightly so, about workplace wellness programs in and of themselves, because there's not an awful lot of evidence for those. And also because actually the people that need those most use them least. And the alternative that I think we'll talk about today, but I would really point business leaders towards, is what I would call indirect interventions, which are ways to shift how your people feel at work by looking at how the work itself is designed and organized. Does that make sense? So rather than trying to impact well-being outside of work, improve it through work by strengthening some of the drivers of that we know really play a role in workplace well-being.
I really want to come back and talk about that because that's fascinating. But I think before we do, topics like well-being and happiness are huge, huge topics. For a business leader, how exactly should we be defining topics like that? And are there ways to measure it? What are kind of successful ways of thinking about these things?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm such a kind of systems thinker. I can't really start with anything without defining it. So it was worth touching on that. And I think because there's a lot of confusion there. So there's a lot of fuzziness around what we actually mean by well-being at work. And at its worst, I think what has happened, if I'm honest, is it's become a little bit of a catch-all for all the things people care about in their jobs: pay, hours, flexibility, team dynamics, stress, office location, the whole lot. And of course, if you measure everything, you end up measuring nothing. And what's actually going on, if you really look at the science, is we're muddling up three quite distinct things. So one is the aspects of workplace wellbeing itself, the ingredients, like what goes into workplace wellbeing. Yeah? The other is the inputs, so the things that influence how we feel at work, or the drivers. And then the third is the outputs, so the downstream consequences that businesses and business leaders experience when they have a happy and a happy workforce that feels like that has a lot of well-being. So if I take those three, if that works, Jamie, I'll take them kind of one by one and just click into them a little bit. So
Yeah.
that first one, the aspects of well-being at work. Well-being, sometimes called subjective well-being in science, is basically about our valuation of the quality of our lives. So how we think and feel about our lives. And in the workplace, that's how we think and feel about our work. And we measure that in three different ways. So one is what's called evaluative well-being. So that speaks to how we think about our jobs overall. It's the classic survey question: on a scale of 0 to 10, how satisfied are you with your job? It's often called job satisfaction, where 0 is not at all and 10 is completely. And that measure is really kind of, it's cognitive, it's really rational. By its nature, it's quite comparative. So in answering that, I'm kind of comparing myself to me a year ago. and where I thought I'd be. I might be comparing myself to you. So that's the first one. The second is affective well-being, which speaks to how we feel at work day to day. It's an emotive experience. So am I feeling happy, excited, calm, anxious, fearful, stressed? And again, the classic measure that there, the question is, how happy did you feel at last work last week on a scale of 0 to 10? And how stressed did you feel? The one thing that's worth pointing out there is that often we think that those two are one and the same, but actually positive and negative feelings are two separate scales. So I can feel both excited and stressed at the same time. And then the third ingredient in well-being itself is what's called, it's a really fancy phrase, I'm afraid, but it's what's called eudaimonic well-being. So it speaks to meaning and purpose. So what we would ask someone in work is, overall, how meaningful or purposeful do you find your work on a scale of 0 to 10? And that it's worth saying that's not the same as corporate purpose, although obviously the two can intersect. So that's well-being and how we would measure it. It's four simple questions. They're taken, they're sort of drawn, they match up to how we measure well-being across in life, how the Office of National Statistics measures it, and the OECD. And then the sort of the second ingredient is what influences those four questions and how we answer those four questions, and that is the drivers of well-being. And here I would probably I'd draw on some amazing work by the incredible George Ward and Jan Emmanuel Deneve at the Oxford Wellbeing Research Centre. They partnered with the jobs website Indeed.com to analyze data from 20 million workers across thousands of countries to identify 6 key drivers of workplace wellbeing. And one was development and security. So feeling secure in our jobs matter. And access to development is obviously crucial. The second is relationships. We know that relationships are a huge driver of life satisfaction and physical and mental health, but it's the aspect of belonging that really matters there. The third is independence and flexibility. And we know since COVID, even more so, that being trusted to manage your time and priorities matters. The fourth is variety and fulfillment. So a sense of broader contribution and a lack of monotony. The fifth is earnings and benefits. So money does matter, but particularly fairness and adequacy, actually. And the sixth is risk and health and safety. So the foundation of feeling physically and psychologically safe is obviously essential. So those influence how we feel at work. That's how we measure how we feel at work. And then the final piece of the puzzle is, so what are the consequences of that? What's the sort of downstream benefits? And there's a lot of now very robust evidence that basically points to the fact that if you have a happy workforce, you will experience better attraction. So you'll attract better talent, more productivity. So people will do better and more at work, and better retention. So people will stay longer and commit more. So it's just pulling those three chunks out separately, I think helps us sort of see the playing field a bit better.
I mean, it sounds really simple, doesn't it? That happy employees will be more productive employees, but there's a lot of science, as you say, behind all of that, and a lot of evidence for business leaders to get their teeth stuck into. On those first topics that you mentioned about how we really measure these things, is that something that you're seeing business leaders increasingly actively measure their workforce on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the answer is sometimes. What's tricky is engagement is a really widespread measure, and engagement includes sort of it overlaps with a number of the drivers of well-being. Does that make sense?
Got you.
Um, and so that is quite kind of ubiquitous in large organizations. I think sort of I would like to see more organizations measure, even in those four questions, well-being in its simplest form more. I think it can get quite clouded, but there are some fantastic organizations out there that have really sophisticated ways and simple ways to measure well-being and to give business leaders a sense of where it's at, how it's changing, and what drives it up and down. So sort of it's starting and there's more to come is probably the answer.
And so I was about to ask you if you think that we're kind of on this trend of kind of ever increasing measurement and sharing of this, but to what extent is any of this data publicly available or shared? If you're a business, how can you measure these things and look at them and think, wow, we're doing really well, or we're not doing so well compared to some of our competitors. We may need to take a look at ourselves and think what we could be doing better.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the first place I would probably look is, and I'm not sure, I think it's pretty public and available, the studies that the team at the Oxford Wellbeing Centre have been doing with Indeed.com. I think a lot of that is publicly available data. And I obviously will all be anonymized, but I think it will provide pretty sound benchmarks. Don't quote me on that, but I think it is. Or at least the analysis is publicly available. I think the other thing I would say is there are some great organizations out there that have really leading edge well-being surveys, really simple ones. And again, don't quote me on this, but to the best of my knowledge, a company, for example, like the Happiness Index, I think there's a version of that that is for free, that business leaders, particularly SMEs, can put into their workforce now and just get a sense of what's going on. And there's so much power, when we understand the lay of the land.
So your message to any SME leaders that might be listening is these resources are out there, so do go take a look.
Yes, yes. I should double check which ones are free and which ones are open source and come back to you with those, Jamie. But absolutely, there are a lot of resources out there, and a lot of really, really good ones.
Perfect. I mean, I suppose this brings us to my next question. Obviously, having this information available is great, but I think information without action is quite meaningless.
Yeah.
So if you're a business and you're kind of looking at how do I create a workforce where my employees are happy, where their well-being is prioritized, where those different factors that go into well-being that you mentioned earlier can all be maximized. Where do I start?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think perhaps the first way to frame it is just to um, think about our sphere of control, because obviously, let's be honest, some of this, what we're talking about, sits outside a leader span of influence. Some of what affects our well-being, particularly kind of mental health aspect of it, is internal or circumstantial. People bring their own predispositions from genetic vulnerabilities to anxiety through to whether they're going through a breakup. But while we can't control everything, I think the message I would love leaders to hear is don't underestimate what you can influence. Each one of us will spend a third of our lives on average at work. And right now, for 1 in 3 of us, those hours are unhappy ones. And that's not okay. And it's in our gift to shape. Um, I mentioned before the distinction between direct interventions, which is sort of effectively the wellness industry, and indirect intervention. So I won't go into that again. I won't bore you. But I think the headline to take out is that you will get so much more benefit from, and I actually almost think it is more scalable and simply, as a practitioner myself, starting there feels more achievable when you try and increase the well-being of your workforce by looking at how work and the experience of work is designed and organized, looking at it systemically and holistically, and improving well-being through work, not off pitch, if you know what I mean, not in a yoga class or through a mindfulness app. Not to downplay those, but and so and that there's some amazing interventions that have fantastic evidence that kind of map to those drivers I mentioned, security, development, flexibility, relationships, growth, etc. I'd love to talk. I mean, if there's time, I'd love to talk specifically about one or two because I was thinking to myself, what feels like low-hanging fruit and feels really easy to just practically get going on. But what I would say is for anyone interested, there's an amazing resource from the World Wellbeing Movement. They've got a manager or leaders playbook that defines all of the kind of very evidence-based interventions, the things you can do in the workplace to shift this. So it's well worth having a look. That just pages of really simple things that you can do. But the two, well, I'll start with one. You can tell me if there's time. Perhaps one I'll start with is job security. So job security is a key driver of well-being, of how we feel at work. 95% of a just under 30,000 person survey rated it the most important job feature. So really high up there, which makes sense, right? And of course, a lot of that sits with public policy, things like active labor policies, but there's a lot that leaders and managers can do. So in a sort of kind of hardwiring sense, contracts are important. Temporary workers feel far more insecure than permanent ones. And across Europe, 10% of our workers are still on temporary contracts. In some countries, it's more like 25%. So if you're in a business where that plays out and you can influence it, it's worth your attention. But a sort of a soft wire kind of action you can take, which is much less obvious, is communication. So, how well I understand my company's direction and the challenges ahead, or even my own role, makes a massive difference. There was a lovely study by Vander Elst that revealed that basically low levels of communication in work are really strongly associated with high levels of job insecurity. And the reason, of course, is that our desire, our kind of ancestral desire to remove uncertainty and create a sense of control is really deeply rooted in us. So leaders can go a long way towards kind of increasing the happiness of their workers by simply communicating more and better, from the CEO right the way through to team supervisors. And perhaps our sort of, I suppose, a slight gear shift here, less about the science and more as a practitioner and a chief people officer myself. I think the thing I would say about communication is obviously not all communication is created equal. I mean, when was the last time you were at a town hall or even a kind of an interactive webinar and no one asked a question, right? That's not really communication. And so I suppose three practical tips I would share is kind of about the difference between good and great is that I think bear in mind it needs to be a two-way conversation, not one-way comms. Podium PowerPoints will only get you so far, but it's actually dialogue, that makes a difference. It's space for real debate and safety for people to challenge and reflect. The second is that I think the best communication has light and dark in it. I think humans need a chance to disagree and wrestle before we can make sense of it ourselves. So I'm always wary of communications that is sort of rose tinted. We need to be asking, what do you like about this? And what do you not like? What feels exciting and what feels scary? And the final kind of, I suppose, pointer I would say is just be wary of not confusing clarity with certainty. A great book, Marcus Buckingham, the author of Love and Work, says that the job of a leader is to provide certainty, isn't to provide certainty, it's to provide clarity. And sometimes I think we can get ourselves kind of tangled between the two. So that's an example of the whole topic of security actually boiled down to, look, what if we just communicated more often and better as a business?
It's all fascinating to hear. And to me, it sounds like so many of these aspects are very interlinked because if you want to create communication with your employees that's two-way, that you can have back and forth, you're probably more likely to be in a company where you've got a culture where you feel secure. Because if you feel secure, you're going to be more happy to engage in that kind of dialogue. So would you say each of these things, they are all distinct things, but they kind of all come together in the culture of a company?
They're absolute spillovers, definitely, and they kind of benefit each other.
Yeah.
100%, 100%.
No, that makes complete sense. So what would you say are the kind of more difficult ones for a company to really tackle? Communicate. I'm not saying improving communication is easy, but
Are you saying that's easy, Jamie?
that's
Yes.
very much not what I'm saying. I've got lots of friends that work in communications and internal comms, and I know how hard they work. But what
Yeah.
would you say are the kind of are there any that are harder and tougher to tackle that might need more time or more attention?
Yeah, gosh, that's such a great question. I think one that is, to use your words, harder and tougher to tackle and needs more attention, but isn't expensive. Does that make sense? None of these things are huge investments in external programs and, specialists. But one that is tougher to tackle is the kind of the ingredient of fulfillment and meaning. So we know that people want valuable work. It's consistently a top priority. And interestingly, actually, some rate, what was it? I think I read somewhere 75% say that the chance to contribute to society through their work is important or very important, and they rate it higher than opportunities for advancement, which is
Wow.
pretty sobering, right? So at that simplest, what that means is connecting your people to your purpose, which we can come on to, but I think is going to be ever more important in the world of AI. And we know that when you do that, it increases well-being. So the sort of this is a slightly sort of awkward personal one here, but I recently ran a study with funded by the LSE, looking at how purpose and sort of task significance helps improve the emotional experience of really hard tasks. So basically, if I know what I'm doing at work, do I feel less stressed or more joy when things are hard? And we found that participants who just simply engaged in why they were doing the task felt 12% higher positive emotions, despite this task, which was very mundane and time pressured. It was sorting data. And it moved them from below the national happiness average to above it quite significantly. So we know that it increases well-being, but whilst it's simple on the surface, it is actually quite hard to get that right. And sort of, I suppose, with a practitioner hat on, the things that are hard are that like sweating the words. Companies do struggle, I think, with how they articulate the role that they play in customers' lives and society.
Yeah.
There are a lot of purpose statements out there, but so many of them fall flat because they're too vague and too generic. You know, your purpose, you need to put time into articulating that in a way that works seriously hard for you. It needs to be properly differentiated. It needs to stretch you today and tomorrow. It needs to be simple enough that everyone can hold in their heads, and it needs to cut through all the corporate clutter out there. And then once you've done that work, and that takes time and debate and disagreement amongst the leadership team, then the hard bit is using your purpose as a tool. So having a purpose is not the same as using it. So often organizations have it as, something on I don't know, a screensaver or something, if those still exist. But purpose-led companies make impact and growth codependent, and they use that purpose day in, day out to make strategic choices, use it to do goal setting, use it to do annual planning, use it to talk to your people about where you're going and why. And then the final ingredient that, again, sort of sounds both simple but is hard, is helping people join the dots between what they're doing on a Tuesday afternoon and why that's important. So that's on leaders to actively connect the what to the why every day, in moments big and small, in hiring, in goal setting, in reviews and feedback, in celebrations. And that, when you do that right, it almost becomes repetitive. It's quite pedantry almost, if you know what I mean, sort of just getting that right. So I think the world of purpose is one where it can look simple, but I think it's hard to wire it in. But I think it's so valuable, and I think it will only become more valuable.
I think you've very eloquently outlined why all of this is so important. But I mean, you'll know this yourself from your time running businesses. Business leaders have so much pressure on them. There's so many things that
Yeah.
you want to invest your time in, invest your resources as a company in, whether that be skills, learning, development, AI, whether that be the plethora of other business functions that you've got on the side. Why should this be something that a business leader sits down and says, I want to invest my resources in this, and we're going to have impact out of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think like a few years ago, it was one that was harder to answer than it is today. A lot has changed. There's been some incredible work done on the business case for it. So I think what we know today is it's not just about doing the right thing by people. It's not just about the social case, which we can come on to, but there's strong causal evidence now linking well-being to business performance. And it's through those downstream kind of impacts I mentioned. So attraction, you attract better talent; productivity, people do more and better; and retention, people stay longer and commit more. Um, Maybe it's worth just touching on productivity for a second, because of those three, that perhaps feels the most tangible. You
I
can
mean,
absolutely imagine what that would feel like.
it feels like
So,
we've been in a productivity puzzle as a nation for the best part
yeah,
of 20 years.
exactly. Exactly. And I think there's just, that the idea that, as you say, that happy workers mean more productive workers has been leadership mythology for a while, but the link's now very well proven in lab settings. So Dan Ariely's famous research was probably some of the first research out there, where basically that team got students to build robots made out of Legos. And the first group, when they finished their robots, they were arranged nicely in front of them. And the second group, the robots were broken down and dismantled. And they found, and everything else was controlled for. They found that those in the first group built 3.4 more complete robots when everything else was equal. than the second group. So that is 47% increase in productivity.
Wow.
And the link's been proven in incredible field studies. So 10 years, a 10-year study with BT call centers found that how people feel between one week and another in terms of their well-being led to a 12% increase in weekly sales directly because of that. So that's sort of, it's worth, what's the word, kind of evidencing productivity when it comes to work, because we talk about it a lot, but there's really good evidence. But I think there's some of the thinking in the studies that I love most, actually, when I'm thinking about the business case, is how that translates to the bottom line.
Yeah.
So we know you've got those three sort of impacts going on in the business, but we also now have pretty good evidence showing the positive relationship between well-being and business financial performance in the form of profitability and value. So building off, there's a chap called Alex Edman who's done incredible work in this space for decades, but building off that important work, the amazing Jan Emmanuel Deneve and Micah Katz and George Ward at the Oxford Wellbeing Centre. I've sort of quoted them. They've got a fantastic book out, by the way, that's worth reading for anyone interested. I think called Workplace Wellbeing, or Why Workplace Wellbeing Matters. But they analyze, this is amazing, they analyze financial performance data from 1,800 US companies alongside 25 million employee survey results. And what they found was that the companies with higher employee wellbeing scores outperformed those with lower scores on traditional performance measures like firm value and profitability and return on assets. But the bit I love is what they did is they ran a kind of a basic portfolio analysis. So they rank ordered the businesses by wellbeing data to create almost imaginary stock portfolio of the top 10, the top 100 happiest companies. So imagine you've got the work wellbeing index, the work wellbeing 100. And they found that for every $1,000 invested in that index in January 1st, 2021, today that $1,000 is worth $1,600 compared to the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq, where that $1,000 is only worth $1,500. So that's a really big difference of 20% additional returns or outperformance in 4 to 5 years. And I love that study because I think it just demonstrates how the stock market and investors are still undervaluing or not correctly kind of, I suppose, capturing or predicting the intangibles of workplace wellbeing and the connection between how your people feel and the quarterly results.
Really fascinating. I'm definitely going to use that statistic because I love that. I think that's a really, really powerful piece of information. I can see some questions coming through in the Q&A box, so be love to get to them. As ever, do pop any questions you might have in the chat box, and we'll try our very best to get to them. But I really like this question from Fred Kelly, who asks, to what extent is the traditional legal employment construct created for the Industrial Revolution now an impediment to the development of workplace well-being? I'm not sure if that's something you've ever thought about, Kate, or have any insight on.
To what extent is a traditional legal employee construct an impediment to workplace well-being?
So do you think the kind of 9 to 5 idea of turning up at an office or a factory
Right, right.
outdated in the age of prioritizing well-being?
Yeah, it's interesting
It's a better
because
way of prioritizing well-being, essentially.
yeah, no, it's such a great question. It's funny you took it to 9 to 5. My head went to a couple of different places. My head also went to job security. So
Mm.
my answer, which is such a wishy-washy answer, is kind of both and. There are aspects of well, I mean, I don't know if this was the case in the Industrial Revolution, but there are aspects of traditional permanent work contracts that support our feeling of job security that is very important for workplace well-being, right? There are aspects of the traditional line management systems whereby I have someone who is accountable, whether, obviously, however skilled they are, is accountable for my success versus a world in the gig economy where your line manager is possibly a chatbot, right? So there are some ingredients that I would caution us to lose too fast. There are other ingredients that we know through very good data that we have to evolve, like flexibility, and kind of the autonomy that goes with that, the independence. And I suppose back to your point about kind of the 9 to 5. Yeah, absolutely. We know a lot now about how important independence and flexibility is. I think something like they found that an average job seeker was willing to take an 8% pay cut to be able to work from home. But the amazing thing I would say on this topic is that it's even just the conversation about how I need to work, a forum to have an open conversation that acknowledges that I am, an individual, and what are the working practices that help set that person or that group of people up for success. Even just having a conversation can be powerful and impact well-being. Um, but yes, the sort of the flexibility and the ability to sort of not have a one size fits all is something that we're on a journey on, but I think we're gonna have to make some big moves around.
And
Um,
I can imagine that there's a lot of I mean, tension's the wrong word, but thinking back to what you said about job security, thinking about people that work freelance, they might have the ability to pick up a portfolio of different jobs or projects they're working on that really align with their purpose and they get a lot out of. Then on the flip side of that, you don't have the job security of that formalized and kind of traditional employment route. So can you see those aspects kind of playing out over the coming years where people start to prioritize one aspect more than the other, or these things start to kind of we start to think about new models of employment that might be able to group all of these things together?
yes, gosh, yeah. Um, I mean, a big topic, kind of new model of
Fair.
employment.
I
Not
think
sure, not
we
sure we can
need
do it justice in a couple of
no.
minutes, but I think maybe what would be helpful is to speak to more of a kind of like a design principle, which is I think we've got to be wary of seeing any of, this fantastic kind of, I suppose, wisdom that as a workforce and as leaders, we've sort of, it's been hard earned, but we've learned a lot, over the last few decades and centuries, but not using that wisdom in a nuanced way and not in a black and white way. Does that make sense? The minute you start to be advocating, obviously we know that there's not a lot of good evidence for return to work mandates and that, flexibility is important, particularly actually avoiding scheduling unpredictability. That's actually where there's a real hit on workplace well-being. But equally, too much flexibility also lowers well-being because the lines between home and life are blurred. So I think we're sort of at the beginning of being able to put a lot of these important ingredients into practice. As we do, let's make sure we do it in a nuanced way rather than kind of extremes, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. Moving on to the next question, Antonio asked, in a time where most businesses are expecting more for less from their employees, how do organizations practically and genuinely keep workplace happiness front of mind? She then asks, and as an employee, how can we hold our companies to account on this? And I think that second aspect of the question is really it's a really interesting thing that we've not really talked about. So, do you have any advice from an employee perspective? How can you push those things as being important in your workplace?
How can you push those things? I mean, yeah, I think it's a great question, and we know that workplaces that have fought a way to channel employee voice really benefit. Actually, I mean, even just the idea of having representation and two-way dialogue between kind of managers and the workforce impacts wellbeing in and of itself. Um, uh, I think that if your organization is quite early on in this journey, starting with measurement is
Yeah.
important. And then my second kind of magic wand would be having using what you've measured to identify some shifts. Don't bite off everything. What are three shifts that you want to go after that feel reasonable and practical? What's the kind of leanest mix that will have the maximum impact? And formalize it as a strategic priority amongst all your other strategic priorities. See it like for like, and track the return on that investment, and have the right sponsors and celebrate the wins, just like you would any other aspect of organizational strategy.
And conscious of time, we're very quickly coming to the end, but I think it would be remiss not to mention this topic. And maybe this sets us up quite nicely for a follow-up discussion at some point. But AI, as we've alluded to so much throughout this conversation, AI is changing so much at the moment, really changing the ways in which people work in many ways for the better, but also there's massive dangers to AI alongside those opportunities and massive changes simply to the way in which people feel in their job and the way in which they see their role.
Yeah.
So in I'm not sure you will be able to do this at all, but in 30 seconds or in 60 seconds, how do you think AI is changing the workplace?
30 or 60 seconds. Uh, I think that um, perhaps let me just answer with some things I think are important to hold as AI changes the workplace. Of course, labor demand and supply is a very real and raw question that deserves a lot of care and thought. But alongside job quantity, I hope that we sweat just as much job quality, assuming they're jobs that will be left, which if you look to past industrial revolutions, it's a strong suggestion there will be. The big questions are being raised, which is, what will quality in these new jobs look like and how will that affect worker well-being? And how is AI undermining or enhancing the drivers of well-being? So, for example, we might be more flexible, but maybe we'll have less human contact and our relationships will be hurt. Or we might have automation that drives up our productivity, but the experience of those tasks affects our well-being, which drives down our productivity. And I think two things that I'm particularly interested right now is that it's when we think about the nature of tasks themselves, how our own well-being plays into how productive we are. That sort of cycle there, I think, is really worth keeping an eye on. Because it's likely that the work left to humans will rely on more emotional and social intelligence, which we know only kicks in when we're in a good state. So that's one, kind of how we need to
Yeah,
equip people to do the
yeah.
work that's left. And then the second is the importance of why. And I think really quickly put, it's sort of over the years, what has been demanded of a great leader has changed. It used to be what, i.e., knowledge, but that was commoditized. And then it was how, i.e., EQ, that was the buzzword. And, it was all about emotional intelligence. But even that is being sort of augmented by AI with,
Mm.
AI-powered coaches whispering into managers' ears. And so I think what is left to distinguish great leaders from good ones is their ability to, well, one of the things is their ability to connect people with why they're coming to work and creating cultures of trust and meaning and giving people a reason to stay.
I think that is
I think
such
that was 60 seconds and I
I don't
didn't scratch the surface,
I
but
admire you for condensing so much information and so much insight there into such a short period of time. And I think that message there at the end is a really, really powerful message to leave on. Kate, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We really, really appreciate it. It's been such an insightful discussion. Lots to take away. I've really got a lot to think about. And I hope everybody in the audience is the same. Again, very, very grateful for joining us for the latest in our Jaws Foundation webinars. Our next webinar will be with Rob Halfon, our Apprenticeships and Skills Director, where we'll be having a deep dive into lots and lots of the changes that have been announced in terms of apprenticeships and skills education and how businesses might want to engage with that. So do keep an eye on your inboxes for more details on that. Kate, thank you for joining us. See
thanks,
you
Jamie.
soon.
Bye.